In everyday life, when people hear the word greed, many immediately think of money, possessions, or materialism. But from a Buddhist perspective, greed is much deeper. It's not just about wanting more things, more money, or higher status. Greed is a state of mind. It's attachment, desire, a tendency to always want to hold on to what one likes and not want to lose what makes one feel comfortable. Therefore, greed can manifest in very subtle ways that many people don't recognize. In Buddhism, the word greed is defined as excessive attachment, desire, or craving for what one likes or wants to possess. Greed is not limited to material possessions. It can also encompass emotional greed, greed for position, greed for superiority, greed for love, and greed for recognition. This is something worth pondering. Some people aren't overly greedy for money, but crave attention. Others aren't overly concerned with possessions, but crave the affection, praise, or recognition of others. Some don't compete for wealth, but always want to be better than others, to maintain their position, to be seen as important, right, or more prominent. On the surface, these forms of greed may seem normal, even encouraged by society. But if you look closely, you'll see that the underlying nature is still a very strong desire for possession, and it is this very clinging that causes human suffering. Buddhism views greed not merely as an external behavior, but as an internal working of the mind. The greedy mind has a very distinct characteristic. It is never satisfied. When it doesn't have something, it wants it. When it has it, it wants more. When it obtains something, it wants to keep it forever. When it sees others possessing something it lacks, it easily leads to comparison. When it loses something it once clung to, it causes suffering, regret, or anxiety. Therefore, greed is not simply wanting, but wanting within attachment. Wanting to eat when hungry isn't necessarily greed. Wanting to work better isn't necessarily greed. Wanting to provide more for one's family isn't necessarily greed. The issue lies in whether one's mind is bound by those desires. If one can strive for something while maintaining clarity, contentment, and not losing peace of mind before achieving or losing it, then it's not necessarily greed. But if one's heart is constantly being pulled along, if one's happiness depends too much on achieving or maintaining that desire, then greed has begun to manifest. That is why Buddhism considers greed one of the three poisons. Greed, anger, and delusion are seen as the three major roots of human suffering. Greed keeps the mind restless, always wanting more, wanting to hold on. When one doesn't achieve what they want, anger arises. When the true nature of greed is not understood, delusion sets in. Therefore, greed is the starting point of many afflictions. This is a very deep psychological process that Buddhism pointed out very early on. People don't usually suffer from the event itself, but rather from their attachment to that event. We want something to happen according to our wishes. We want someone to love us as we desire. We want life to go according to our plan. We want to be perceived as we expect. And when reality doesn't follow those wishes, the mind begins to feel discomfort, disappointment, frustration, hurt, or anger. That's when greed turns into hatred. When we fail to see the reason for our suffering, we don't recognize the root cause lies in our inner attachments, and instead continue to blame circumstances, others, or frantically search for something else to fill the void. That is delusion. In other words, delusion is a lack of clear vision. A lack of clear vision of the impermanent nature of all things. A lack of clear vision of our own desires that bind us. Lack of clear vision that, the more we cling to something that cannot be held on to forever, the more we suffer. Therefore, greed is not a minor issue. It is the starting point of many troubles in life. Much of the fatigue, envy, conflict, disappointment, breakdown, and insecurity all have traces of greed somewhere within them. Sometimes it's greed for material things. Sometimes it's greed for emotions. Sometimes it's greed for control. Sometimes it's greed for right. Sometimes it's greed for winning or losing. Sometimes it's greed for attention. Sometimes it's greed for a beautiful image of oneself. The point is, the more subtle greed is, the harder it is to recognize. Some people think they are simply living with purpose, but in reality, they harbor an insecurity that makes them feel fulfilled only when they have achieved more. Some people think they are simply in love, but in reality, they are driven by a desire to possess and control. Some people think they are simply striving, but in reality, they are consumed by a thirst for recognition. Some people think they are simply living responsibly, but in reality, they are clinging to the image of perfection, superiority, or high regard. Buddhism does not condemn people for being greedy. Greed is a very natural part of an unenlightened mind. The important thing is not to hate oneself for being greedy, but to learn to recognize it. When one begins to see it clearly, one has the opportunity to avoid being unconsciously dragged down by it. Looking deeper, greed is also linked to a very common illusion, the belief that simply having more of what one desires will bring peace, that achieving that will be enough, that the other person will love one as much as one hopes, and one will be happy. But life shows the opposite. Even after obtaining something, the mind is still not at peace. Even after achieving something, the heart still feels a sense of lack. After being loved, one fears losing it. After success, one desires even greater things. Because suffering doesn't lie in how much one lacks, but in the fact that one's mind doesn't know where to stop. Therefore, understanding the concept of greed in Buddhism is not about viewing it as a distant religious concept, but about reflecting on one's own life. What are we greedy for that we haven't yet named? What are we bound to? Are we suffering because of our circumstances, or because of our desires regarding those circumstances? Are we truly living, or are we being led astray by an endless chain of desires? Simply by beginning to ask those questions, people enter a different level of understanding. Because when we see greed, we begin to have the opportunity to no longer live completely under its control. And that is a very important step on the path from suffering to enlightenment, from attachment to freedom, from anxiety to deeper peace within ourselves. When the word greed is mentioned, many people immediately think of money, possessions, wealth, or power. And so, many breathe a sigh of relief, thinking they're not that greedy. They don't excessively compete for money, they don't disregard everything to get rich, they're not overly materialistic, so surely they're not greedy. But if we look at it from a Buddhist perspective and delve deeper into our inner lives, we'll see that greed is much broader. It's not just about tangible things, but also lies in the intangible desires that nonetheless control people every day. Greed isn't just about wanting more money. Many people think greed is only about material possessions, but in reality, the word greed has a much broader meaning. Some people aren't greedy for money, but they are greedy for praise, attention, being catered to, or the feeling that they are always right. These are very common forms of greed, but they are rarely recognized. This is where greed lies most subtly. Material greed is easier to spot. A person who is excessively greedy for money, possessions, or wealth is easily recognizable. But emotional greed, greed for position, recognition, love, being considered right, prominence, or having others follow one's wills, much easier to disguise with seemingly plausible reasons. Some people say they only want respect, but deep down they crave constant recognition. Some say they only want clarity, but in reality, they crave control. Some say they only offer constructive criticism, but beneath the surface, they crave being right. Some people don't care about money, but they suffer greatly if they aren't noticed, mentioned, or considered important. Some people don't compete for material possessions, but they always feel they understand more, delve deeper, and stand out in any conversation or relationship. These forms of greed are very common but rarely recognized because they are linked to very deep psychological needs of human beings. Everyone wants to be loved, recognized, listened to, and considered valuable. These needs themselves are not wrong. The problem only begins when people stop simply desiring them and become attached to them. That is, when they need them so much that their absence causes anxiety, discomfort, hurt, or imbalance. For example, everyone likes to be praised. It's perfectly normal. But if a person becomes dependent on praise, expecting recognition, approval, and acclaim for everything they do, and feels disappointed, annoyed, or demotivated when they don't receive it, then praise is no longer a simple pleasure. It has become an object of greed. Similarly, everyone wants to be treated kindly. But if a person always wants everyone to cater to their wishes, understand them, and do exactly what they want, immediately becomes annoyed, hurt, or angry if anyone disagrees, then that is no longer a normal need. That is greed, a desire for control, a craving for the feeling that everything must operate according to their ego. One of the most subtle forms of greed is the desire to always be right. Some people don't compete for money or profit, living relatively simply. yet they suffer greatly if challenged, criticized, or pointed out their mistakes. They don't necessarily need to be materially superior, but they desperately want to be right, more knowledgeable, and more insightful. Therefore, they can argue persistently, have deep-seated pride, and are very difficult to sway in situations that touch their ego. That's also greed, but a very subtle form. When we see these forms of greed, we begin to understand why we suffer in seemingly small things. Much of the sadness, frustration, and disappointment in life doesn't stem from a lack of significant things, but from being bound by small yet persistent desires. We long for others to understand us a little better. We long for more attention. We long to be right a little more. We long for things to go our way a little more. But it is precisely these little desires, when accumulated, that can weigh heavily on the human heart. Why does greed make people never feel satisfied? Because the nature of greed is to always want more than they currently have. They possess something, the greedy mind quickly considers it normal and continues to demand more. Therefore, people living in greed often find it very difficult to achieve a sense of contentment. Even if they outwardly possess a great deal, this is a very profound inner law. When we don't have something, we think that simply achieving it will bring peace. We think that having that job, that relationship, that money, that position, that recognition will be enough. But once we achieve it, the satisfaction usually lasts only a very short time. Afterwards, the mind begins to shift to another goal, another desire, another deficiency. Having received praise, one craves more. Having gained attention, one fears losing it. Having found love, one desires to be loved more, understood better, and prioritized. Having achieved success, one desires even greater accomplishments. Having attained a degree of security, one desires even more certainty. Therefore, the greedy mind does not truly live in the present. It is always preoccupied with what it lacks or clinging to what it possesses. And that's why people living in greed find it so hard to achieve a sense of contentment. It's not because they're always lacking externally, but because internally they have a mechanism that always feels insufficient. Once the mind gets used to operating in that way, no matter how much more is given, it will always find another void to continue demanding. This is something worth pondering in modern life. There are people who outwardly possess many things: stable jobs, loved ones, a secure position, good living conditions, yet inwardly they remain restless, weary, and unable to find peace. Why? Because their minds cannot find peace. And a mind that cannot find peace finds it very difficult to achieve lasting happiness. Buddhism doesn't teach people to abandon all desires and become indifferent to life. The core principle isn't about not wanting, but about not letting desires lead you astray. See it, understand it. Learn to live with purpose, but without losing inner freedom. Strive hard while maintaining contentment. Appreciate what you have before chasing after what you lack. Sometimes what causes human suffering isn't that life gives too little, but that our hearts demand too much. And the first step to escaping that suffering isn't about acquiring more, but about beginning to clearly see what we're clinging to. Only when we see this can we have the opportunity to stop. And only when we know when to stop can we truly touch something precious that greed can never give. The feeling of contentment and inner peace. In the eyes of many, happiness is often associated with having more money, having a better job, having a better house, having a higher position, having more recognition. And because of this belief, people often rush forward thinking that just a little more will make life easier and bring more peace of mind. But the reality of life shows something worth pondering. Having more doesn't necessarily mean peace. Achieving more doesn't necessarily mean ease. And not everyone who has more lives a more comfortable life. The story of the increasingly anxious person who has more is a clear illustration of this. There are people who earn more money, achieve more, but become increasingly worried, stressed, and afraid of losing it. They don't truly enjoy what they have because their minds are always drawn to what they haven't achieved. This shows that suffering doesn't always come from lack, but often from insatiable greed. If you look closely, this kind of suffering is very common in modern life. There are people who, from the outside, everyone thinks they should be happy. They have ability, wealth, position, and achievements that many people dream of. But inside, they are not at peace at all. They don't sleep soundly. Their minds are restless. a silent worry always follows them. Worry about falling behind, worry about being overtaken, worry about losing what they have, worry about not being strong enough, worry about not having enough, worry about not being secure enough, worry about not being prominent enough, worry about not being better than others. The problem here isn't that they have a lot. Having a lot isn't inherently bad. Money, achievements, good living conditions, or personal development all have their own value. What causes them suffering isn't the possessions themselves, but the mindset that accompanies them. When greed takes over, everything changes. Achievements cease to be a source of joy and become a burden to maintain. Money is no longer a means of living, but something to be constantly afraid of losing. A position is no longer a responsibility, but becomes a place for the ego to cling to. And from there, the more they have, the more insecure they become. There are people who have suffered greatly because they haven't achieved what they want. They think that once they reach a certain milestone, they can finally breathe a sigh of relief. But even after arriving, they don't truly get to rest, because as soon as they achieve one thing, their minds quickly shift to the next. They feel it's not enough as soon as they have it. As soon as they've touched it, they feel they need to go further. And so their lives become like an endless chase. Every time they think they're about to find peace, a new goal appears. This is the insidious cycle of greed. It gives people no rest. It constantly whispers, just a little more. But that more has no end, because the nature of greed is never enough. Once the mind becomes accustomed to living in that mechanism, it becomes very difficult for people to truly enjoy what they have. Because even when they achieve something, they are not fully present in that joy. They begin to think about how to keep it, how to get even more, or how to avoid being surpassed by anyone. Some people spend their whole lives busy accumulating wealth, but when they become more prosperous, they live in more anxiety. They worry because the more they have, the more they feel they have to lose. They worry because the higher they climb, the more they fear falling. They worry because the more accustomed they become to a certain standard of living, a certain image, a certain position, the more unbearable the thought of losing it becomes. Thus, instead of finding greater freedom from their possessions, they are held captive by those very possessions. This reveals a profound truth. Suffering doesn't always stem from lack. Often, it comes from insatiable greed. And without realizing this, people can spend years pursuing what they believe will liberate them, only to end up binding themselves even more. Conversely, the story of those who know contentment and find peace of mind opens up a very different perspective on life. There are people who aren't overly wealthy, but live very lightly. They still strive, work, and develop themselves, but they don't let their desires drag them into a cycle of exhaustion. They understand that living well isn't about having a lot, but about knowing what is enough for a peaceful life. These are the kinds of people worth observing. They aren't the type to give up or lack ambition. They still work seriously. They still have goals. They still care about their family, their future, and their personal development. But the difference lies in the fact that they don't let their desires consume their lives. They don't trade inner peace for a little extra wealth. They understand that effort is necessary, but not everything is worth striving for, to the point of losing themselves. Oh, they know the difference between need and greed. They know when to move forward and when to stop. They appreciate what they have instead of constantly looking at what they don't have. And because of this, their hearts are lighter. Those who know contentment often possess a unique kind of freedom. This freedom isn't because they have no desires, but because they aren't led astray by desires. They can find joy in simple things: a peaceful meal, a decent day at work, a tranquil home, a few sincere friends, sufficient health, and a mind free from excessive turmoil. These things may sound ordinary, but for those who know contentment, they are already blessings. They can still dream, but their dreams aren't accompanied by insatiable hunger. They can still grow, but not in a state of constantly feeling inadequate. They can still earn money, but they don't let money become the sole source of their sense of security. They can still do well, but they don't feel compelled to be better than others to feel meaningful. That's why they live more peacefully. Not because life is less challenging, but because their minds are less conflicted. And that's what's truly valuable. If I had to draw one profound lesson from these two stories, it would probably be this. What determines a peaceful life is not just how much you have, but how your mind lives with what you have. Having much but a constantly lacking heart will still lead to suffering. Having just enough but knowing when to stop will bring peace. Life doesn't forbid people from striving for progress. But if that progress leads to a loss of contentment, then the further you go, the more exhausted you may become. Conversely, when you know what is enough for yourself, you not only live more lightly, but also begin to touch something much deeper: inner wealth. A wealth that doesn't lie in how much you possess, but in whether your heart is still perpetually hungry and thirsty. And sometimes, that is the true boundary between a life of constant lack and a life that begins to find peace. Greed isn't limited to money or material possessions. It also infiltrates areas people consider most beautiful and legitimate emotions: relationships, work, and the desire for success. Some forms of greed may not seem bad at first glance. They might appear as love, effort, responsibility, or ambition. But upon closer examination, one can see that behind many everyday sufferings, there's often a subtle form of attachment at work. Greed in love and relationships is one of the forms of greed that causes the most pain, yet is the hardest to recognize. Some people crave being loved unconditionally, crave having someone always understand them, always be by their side, and always fulfill their desires. This clinging makes relationships heavy and easily leads to hurt. Often we don't suffer from a lack of love, but from wanting to possess too much. At first glance, desires such as being loved, understood, and having companionship seem perfectly normal. Indeed, these are very natural human needs. No one enters a relationship without hoping to be cared for, listened to, and connected. But the issue isn't about what we want, but how much we cling to that desire. When you're in love, it's easy to develop a desire for them to always prioritize you. You want them to understand you without you having to say too much. You want them to always be there when you need them. You want them to react exactly as you expect. You want them to never change. You want them to never leave. You want them to never disappoint you. Initially, these desires might seem like just a need for love. But if you delve deeper, you'll see that they contain a great deal of attachment and possessiveness. The problem is that no one can fulfill all those things perfectly forever. No one can always understand your moods correctly. No one can always be present as you expect. No one can perfectly match your expectations at every stage. And when real life clashes with those desires, people begin to suffer. Many people think they suffer because they aren't loved enough. But in reality, they might be being loved in a way that the other person could. It's just not in the way they cling to their preconceived notions. Some people don't suffer from a lack of attention, but from wanting to be cared for in the way they desire. Some people don't suffer from complete indifference from the other person, but from the fact that the other person can't always put them at the center of their lives as they expect. It is the excessive desire for possession that makes feelings burdensome. From love, it easily turns into control. From attachment, it easily turns into dependence. From longing for each other, it easily turns into fear of losing each other. And when the fear of loss becomes too great, people begin to hold on to each other through worry, demands, reproach, scrutiny, and disappointment. At that point, feelings are no longer a place of refuge, but gradually become a place where both partners become exhausted. Some people love deeply but suffer greatly, not because they loved the wrong person, but because they placed too many expectations on love. They wanted the other person to fill the voids within them. They wanted the other person to heal their loneliness. They wanted the other person to be a source of security, value, and happiness. But no one person can shoulder all of that for another. And when a relationship is forced to fulfill so many functions, it easily breaks. Therefore, we often suffer not from a lack of love, but from an excessive desire to possess. We want to keep someone all to ourselves. We want that person to always be exactly as we wish. We want the beautiful feelings to last forever. We want no distance, no differences, no disappointment. But true love doesn't work that way. It can only be light when accompanied by respect, freedom, and the ability to accept that the other person is also a world of their own, not a spiritual possession to be held tightly. If greed in love causes suffering through attachment to others, then greed in work and success causes suffering through attachment to achievements and self-worth. Greed for work and success is also a very common trait in modern society. Ambition isn't inherently bad, but if greed is allowed to lead, people can easily sacrifice their health, integrity, and peace of mind in pursuit of achievement. When success becomes a means of proving one's worth at all costs, it easily becomes a burden instead of a source of joy. In fact, the desire to develop, do well at work, improve one's life, or achieve success is entirely positive. A person with ambition, goals, and a desire to improve is valuable. However, the line between healthy ambition and greed is very thin, and people no longer work for meaning, but to prove themselves superior. When they no longer develop for a better life, but for fear of being looked down upon. When they no longer strive out of responsibility, but out of an obsession with being better, more prominent, and possessing more to feel valuable, then their work begins to be tainted by greed. There are people who work without rest. It's not because they truly need to, but because deep down they have a great fear that if they stop, they will be left behind. If they slow down, they will fall behind. If they don't achieve more, they will become insignificant. And so they push relentlessly. Each milestone they achieve only brings them temporary relief, and then another milestone appears. Another income level, another position, another title, another recognition. Success then ceases to be the culmination of a meaningful journey and becomes a yardstick for verifying a person's worth. And when one becomes too fixated on achievements, they easily live under constant pressure. Just a setback at work, a decline in performance, being surpassed by others, or not being recognized as desired, can severely destabilize one's state of mind. Because at that point, what's affected isn't just the job, but the feeling of whether one still has any value. Therefore, greed in work not only takes away time and health, but it also silently erodes character and inner peace. Some people, driven by an overwhelming desire to advance, gradually accept things they previously didn't want to do. Others, consumed by a desire for superiority, become competitive, cold, and insincere. Some appear more successful year after year, but inwardly lose their joy in life. Looking deeper, we see that in both relationships and work, what exhausts people is not just the circumstances, but the degree of attachment in their minds. When love is too clingy, love becomes a burden. When work is too clingy, success becomes shackles. And in both these areas, what people need is not to give up everything, but to learn to love and strive without losing their inner freedom. We can still love deeply without possessiveness. We can still give our all without sacrificing our peace of mind. We can still have goals without letting them consume our lives. That is perhaps one of the most difficult but valuable lessons of maturity. It's not about forcing ourselves to live with fewer desires, but about living more mindfully, recognizing when desires are beginning to become a burden. And only when we realize that, can we gradually move from greed to understanding, from heaviness to lightness, from attachment to greater peace in our own lives. Greed rarely manifests itself in an obvious form from the outset. It doesn't usually enter people's lives in big, bad, or extreme ways. Most of the time it arrives subtly, logically, and naturally. It might begin with a little dissatisfaction, a little comparison, a little discomfort, a desire to be better, to possess, to achieve, to avoid losing. And if not recognized early, these seemingly small things can gradually grow into a powerful force, silently influencing how people think, live, and choose. The signs that greed is silently growing are often not loud or obvious. These could include feelings of dissatisfaction with what one has, constant comparison to others, difficulty finding joy in the success of others, a desire to control everything, or anxiety when desires are not fulfilled. These are very common signs, yet they clearly reflect the inner greed. One of the most noticeable signs is a persistent feeling of dissatisfaction with the present. It's not the kind of positive dissatisfaction that drives progress, but rather a constant feeling of lack, of never having enough, of feeling that what one possesses is inadequate, unattractive, or not as valuable as what others have. People with a growing sense of greed find it very difficult to remain content with what they have. Even if they achieve something, their joy is fleeting, and they quickly shift to a state of feeling unsatisfied. Some people are never satisfied with money. Some are never satisfied with attention. Some are never satisfied with affection. Some are never satisfied with status or achievements. Outwardly, they may be different, but inwardly, they share one thing in common. Their minds are always in a state of wanting more. And it is this very state that makes it difficult for them to attain true peace. Another very common sign is constantly comparing oneself to others. Comparison is a fairly natural human reflex, but when it becomes a habit, it easily fosters greed. When people constantly look at others to measure their own worth, they find it very difficult to feel content with their lives. Seeing others have even a little more than others causes their hearts to waver. Seeing others more loved, wealthier, more talented, or more prominent causes inner turmoil. Even more dangerous is that there are times when we not only feel sad about what we lack, but also find it difficult to be happy about the good things others have achieved.
Ow.
This is a sign worth reflecting on. When we hear about someone's success and feel heavy-hearted, when we see others being loved and feel uneasy, when others progress and instead of congratulating them, we feel restless or want to deny their value. These reactions aren't always due to our own flaws, but they show that our ego and inner greed are being somewhat aroused. Another manifestation of greed is the constant desire to control everything according to one's own will. This includes not only material possessions, but also people, emotions, outcomes, situations, and even how things should unfold. People with silently growing greed often find it difficult to accept that life doesn't go as they wish. They want others to understand them in the way they desire. They want work to go the way they plan. They want relationships to function according to their expectations. And when things don't go that way, they easily become anxious, irritable, disappointed, or unbalanced. This shows that greed is not just about wanting more, but also about wanting to hold on tight and control. When the mind becomes accustomed to wanting everything to go its way, people become very tired, because life cannot operate entirely according to anyone's ego. And the more we want to hold on tightly, the more easily we will suffer when things change. The final, but crucial sign is the anxiety of not achieving one's desires. Some people are so upset by just one unfulfilled wish that their whole day is ruined. Their emotions become turbulent if someone doesn't respond as they hoped. These reactions show that what they desire is no longer just a normal wish, but has become something their mind clings to for a sense of security or worth. Why is it that the more greedy a person is, the easier it is to lose themselves? When greed becomes excessive, people easily justify wrongdoings, disregard moral boundaries, and live in prolonged exhaustion. Some people initially only want to live better lives, but gradually allow greed to lead them to far away from the values they once cherished. This is the truly terrifying part of greed. Initially, very few people enter a wrong choice with the clear understanding that they are losing themselves. Most deviations begin with seemingly legitimate reasons, just wanting a little better, just wanting more opportunities, just wanting less loss, just wanting more security, just wanting not to be left behind. But when that desire grows and is no longer guided by reason, it can drag people very far. Some people initially just want to make a better living, but gradually accept ways of doing things that go against their conscience. Some initially only want recognition, but then begin living for image, for competition, for the opinions of others. Some initially only want to maintain a relationship, but later become controlling, dependent, and lose kindness in their love. Some initially only want to progress, but then let ambition consume their peace of mind, health, and what were once their true priorities. The more greedy a person is, the easier it is to justify wrongdoing, because when something becomes too important in one's heart, it's easy to find reasons to defend it. If one is too greedy for success, one may allow oneself to disregard principles. If one is too greedy for love, one may allow oneself to control others. If one is too greedy for what is right, one may allow oneself to hurt others with words. If one is too greedy for recognition, one may allow oneself to live untrue to oneself. And then the most painful thing is that many people don't realize they're losing themselves right then and there. They only see themselves trying, striving, protecting what's important. But gradually, they become estranged from the very values they once cherished. Kindness diminishes, sincerity diminishes, ease of feeling diminishes. Instead, tension, calculation, and defensiveness increase. Greed also makes people prone to prolonged exhaustion, because greed doesn't allow the mind to rest. It always demands more. It's always worried about keeping. It's always afraid of losing. It's always feeling insufficient. Such a mind finds it very difficult to achieve deep peace. Outwardly, it may still be progressing, but inwardly, it is becoming increasingly depleted. If there's one practical lesson to be learned from all of this, perhaps the most important is to recognize greed when it's still very small. Don't wait until you lose something big to look back and see. Pay attention to the times when you find it hard to be happy about the good things others have done. The times when you feel that what you have is no longer enough, even though you've just achieved something. The times when you get frustrated simply because things don't go your way. Times when you start willing to overlook a certain value just to get more of what you want. Greed doesn't grow overnight, but if left undetected, it can silently grow to the point of pulling a person away from themselves without them realizing it. Sometimes, what's most needed isn't more possessions, but to pause long enough to ask, does what I'm pursuing truly help me live a deeper, brighter, and more peaceful life? Or is it just making my inner ego bigger and more weary? When one dares to ask this honestly, they have the opportunity to reconnect with themselves before going too far. Greed is not something that can simply disappear by listening to a lecture or reminding oneself not to be greedy. If it were that easy, humanity would suffer far less. Greed is a very deep mental state, often not manifested in superficial behavior, but rather in underlying motives. Feelings of inadequacy, fear of inferiority, the habit of comparison, and the need to possess for a sense of security. Therefore, to transform greed, one cannot simply force oneself to abandon it externally, but must learn to look directly within. The method for identifying and transforming greed lies not in self-judgment, but in honestly observing one's own heart. The first step is to honestly observe one's heart. Ask yourself, are you pursuing what you truly need, or simply because you don't want to be inferior to others? Are you living for true values, or to fill an inner void? Clearly understanding your motives is the first step in transforming a greedy heart. This seems simple, but it's actually very difficult, because people often don't easily look directly at their true motives. We're used to explaining all our desires with seemingly logical reasons. I want more money to secure my future. I want to be more successful to develop myself. I want the other person to love me more because I need to be appreciated. I want to be recognized because I've worked hard. All of these are partly true. But if we delve a little deeper, sometimes we'll see that there are other layers beneath. Sometimes we not only want to grow, but also fear losing to others. Sometimes we not only want to be loved, but also want to possess completely. Sometimes we not only want to do well, but also want to prove our worth. Sometimes we not only want to make ends meet, but are trying to fill some kind of insecure void inside with achievement, money, attention, or a feeling of superiority. Without a clear understanding of motives, people easily believe they are living for what is right, when in reality they are being led astray by greed. This is why the first step in transformation is not to try to eliminate all desires, but to learn to clearly see what is pulling you in the wrong direction. You can start with very simple, but very real questions. Is what I'm pursuing truly necessary for this life? If others don't see it or praise it, would I still want it? If there's no one to compare it to, would I still find it so important? If I don't achieve it, will it hurt because I've lost my true value? Or because my ego has been hurt? These questions aren't meant to upset me, but to bring me closer to my inner truth. Sometimes simply seeing things clearly can lighten the heart. Because some things we once thought were very important turn out to be just reactions to inner deficiencies. Some things we clung to for a long time weren't truly necessary, but because we feared being left behind, being looked down upon, or not being enough. When we realize this, we begin to have a chance to live more freely instead of constantly chasing things that don't truly bring peace. After identifying the root cause, the next step is to practice living less greedy in daily life. The way to practice living less greedy in daily life isn't about giving up all desires, but about learning not to let desires control your life. Learn to be content with what you have. Know when to stop, reduce comparisons. Stop clinging too tightly, and learn to be grateful for what you already possess. The first and most important thing is to learn to be content with the basics. Being content doesn't mean stopping your growth or accepting a life below your means. Being content is recognizing that there are things that, once you have enough, only burden your heart if you keep demanding more. For example, having a stable standard of living, a decent job, a family you can still share meals with, healthy body to get through the day, and a few genuine relationships. These are already precious foundations whose value many people forget while rushing through life. Those who are never content often only see what they lack. Those who are content can still dream, but they don't completely deny what they already have. This is a very profound practice, as it goes against the greedy mind's habit of always looking upwards and always feeling inadequate. The next thing is learning when to stop. There are arguments you don't need to win. There are relationships you don't need to maintain at all costs. There are goals you don't need to pursue to the point of sacrificing your health and peace of mind. There are possessions, expenses, pursuits, images, and recognitions that if you pause for a moment, you'll realize you don't really need them. Knowing when to stop is a crucial skill for transforming greed. Greed constantly urges us to keep going, to hold on, to take more, to surpass. It rarely stops on its own. If people don't cultivate the ability to stop, they can easily be swept away without knowing where they're going. Another very important practice is to reduce comparison. Much of greed is nurtured not only by what one truly lacks, but also by what one sees others possessing. Sometimes one might be fine before, but simply seeing someone better than oneself in some way can cause inner turmoil. Comparison makes it very difficult to find peace of mind because there will always be someone better than oneself somewhere. If one constantly uses others as a yardstick, it will be very difficult to be content with one's life. Instead of comparing yourself to others, try looking back at your own life more clearly. How far have you come compared to your past self? What valuable things do you possess that you may have become accustomed to and no longer notice? What kind of life do you truly want to live, not what others are living? When you look back deeply into your own life, the greed fueled by the desire to surpass others will gradually weaken. Besides that, learning to be less possessive is also a very necessary practice. Much suffering doesn't come from not having something, but from the fear of losing it. Fear of losing people, fear of losing your position, fear of losing your image, fear of losing your sense of control, fear of losing familiar things. But life is constantly changing. The tighter you hold on, the more tired you become. The more you cling, the more pain you feel when things shift. Being less possessive doesn't mean giving up or being irresponsible. It means learning to love, work, strive, and appreciate while still allowing everything space to be itself. It means not turning others into your emotional possessions. It's not turning success into a place to deposit all your self-worth. It's not making external things the sole support for your inner sense of security. Finally, a very simple yet transformative practice is learning to be grateful. Grateful people are less likely to be greedy because they see the value of what they already have. Ungrateful people are easily led astray by a feeling of lack, because they always feel that what they have is not enough or too ordinary to appreciate. You can start very small. Be grateful for a peaceful day. Be grateful for a satisfying meal. Be grateful for the people who are still by your side. Be grateful for the body that still helps you get through the day. Be grateful for the lessons that once hurt you but made you stronger. When gratitude is nurtured, greed will have less room to flourish. Transforming greed isn't something that can be accomplished in a single day. It's a journey of self-reflection, recognizing what's pulling you in the wrong direction, and gradually living more mindfully, lightly, and authentically. It's not about abandoning all desires, but about learning not to let desires control your life. And perhaps, that's one of the most crucial steps for people to move from living in a state of scarcity to living from an inner self that begins to appreciate contentment and find greater peace. There are periods in life when people don't necessarily lack a lot, but still live with a weariness that's hard to describe. Everything on the outside might seem fine. Work isn't terrible. Life isn't hopeless. There are still valuable things around. But inside, there's a heavy feeling, a sense of emptiness, a feeling of incomplete joy, of not being truly at peace. Sometimes we think it's because the circumstances aren't good enough. Sometimes we think it's because we haven't achieved what we need to achieve. Sometimes we think just a little more, and everything will be all right. But often, what's making us tired isn't as external as we think, but lies within our own hearts. The practical lesson for the audience lies here. If today you find yourself tired, anxious, constantly lacking satisfaction, or struggling to enjoy the present, it's very likely not that life is lacking, but rather that your mind is too greedy. Recognizing this isn't about self-blame, but about starting to live more mindfully and lightly. This is something worth pondering because most people are used to looking for the external causes of suffering. We suffer because we don't have enough money. We suffer because others don't understand us. We suffer because our job isn't what we want. We suffer because we haven't achieved as much success as others. We suffer because we don't have what we desire. All of these may be partly true, but if we stop there, we can easily live our whole lives feeling that having more will ease the burden. In reality, many hardships don't disappear with more because their root lies not in external lack, but in an inner lack of contentment. There are people who have a lot, but still feel restless. There are people who have come a long way, but still feel left behind. There are people who are loved, but still feel empty. There are people who have achieved great things, but still can't reach a sense of contentment. This shows that sometimes the problem is no longer that life gives us too little, but that our hearts are demanding too much. Greed isn't always manifested as overt greed as people often think. Sometimes it's simply a state of never having enough, always wanting a little more, wanting a little more recognition, wanting a little more love, wanting to succeed a little faster, wanting everything to go a little more according to one's wishes, wanting life to be less difficult, wanting others to not disappoint. These little desires sound very ordinary, but if they persist and accumulate, they will cause the human mind to be constantly strained, demanding more or clinging tightly. And when the mind is constantly in that state, it's very difficult to enjoy the present. Because no matter what one has, the mind quickly gravitates towards what one lacks. Even if today is peaceful, the mind worries about whether it can maintain that peace tomorrow. Even if something has just been achieved, the mind immediately shifts to another goal. That's why many people aren't living terribly, but they live very weary lives. Not because life is too harsh, but because their minds are being dragged along by unspoken desires without realizing it. The important thing is that when we realize this, we don't need to blame ourselves. We don't need to conclude that we are bad, greedy, or not good. Because greed is a very human trait. It's present in most of us to varying degrees. The issue isn't whether we are greedy or not, but whether we are aware enough to recognize where it is leading us. Recognizing greed isn't about hating yourself, but about starting to live more consciously. It's about not blaming everything on circumstances when you feel uneasy. It's about stopping and asking yourself what you're clinging to when you're overwhelmed by something. It's about asking yourself what you're chasing when you feel exhausted from constantly moving forward, and whether what you're pursuing truly leads to peace. That's a crucial shift. From living by habit to living with observation, from being dragged along without knowing it to beginning to understand what's going on inside oneself, just by making that shift, a person becomes much lighter. The profound meaning of the word greed in Buddhism lies precisely in this. In Buddhism, greed is not just a vice to be avoided, but also a mirror for people to look back at the deep-seated attachments within themselves. When greed is reduced, the mind becomes lighter. When contentment is known, the heart finds peace. And only when no longer being dragged along by endless desires can one truly have the opportunity to touch inner peace. This is a very profound aspect of Buddhism. Greed is not simply viewed as a matter of moral right or wrong. It's not just about taking from someone, competing with someone, or desiring excessive wealth. It's also a mirror reflecting the deeply ingrained attachments within the mind. Those things we consider normal, but are actually binding us. Those desires we think are legitimate, but are actually exhausting us. Those things we cling to without realizing they are depriving us of our freedom. Therefore, when learning about greed, the most valuable thing is not to judge others, but to look back at ourselves. Look at what is weighing down your heart. Look at where you are placing too much hope. Look at what you are clinging to so much that if it deviates from your wishes, you immediately feel uneasy. Each time you realize this, you are untangling a knot in your heart. And when greed diminishes, the first thing that changes isn't the circumstances, but the quality of one's inner self. The mind begins to lighten, less tense, less chasing after, less clinging, less comparing, less proving. Wants to fulfill one's needs. At that point, a person begins to have inner space to breathe, to feel, to live more deeply with the simple things that may have previously been overlooked. When you know when you have enough, your heart will be at peace. This isn't a comforting saying for giving up. Knowing when you have enough isn't about stopping living, growing, or dreaming. It's about the ability to live with your goals without losing your inner peace. It's knowing what's worth pursuing and what will only tire you out if you try to hold on to it. It's appreciating what you have instead of constantly focusing on what you don't have. It's knowing that some things, the more you try to hold on to them, the more pain you'll feel. And some things, if you dare to let go, will bring a great deal of relief. Ultimately, what Buddhism aims to lead people to is not a life of impoverished desires, but a less dependent inner self. Only when no longer dragged along by endless desires can people truly have the opportunity to attain inner peace. This peace doesn't come from a perfect life, but from a mind free from constant need, constant demands, and constant worry. And perhaps that is one of the deepest freedoms a person can learn in life. It's not freedom from having everything, but freedom from no longer letting things pull you too far away from yourself. Life doesn't necessarily have to be lighter to be less. Sometimes, simply reducing greed can bring a much lighter heart. Everyone has their own desires, but if we know how to reflect, know when to stop, and know when enough is enough, life will be much less painful. If you find this video thought-provoking, please like, share. Subscribe to the Simple Philosophy channel to spread life lessons that bring peace of mind and a lighter life every day.